she said that she wasn't there for the night. She was moving with her grandson, living with her sister, or moved in with the friend. All she got out was her pocketbook.
Oh, yeah.
And some kind of flight that must belong to her grandson. He was in some kind of flight she got. The fireman ran back in and got her pocketbook. She had all these markers.
Before we begin, did everyone get a new class book? Yeah? Yeah, no? Yeah, yeah. Need one? Need one? Who needs one? We'll be using our Bible mostly, but you'll still need this. There you go. Do y'all need one? No? You got one? Good, good, good. Okay. It's the Lord's Day. That makes it a wonderful day, despite the festivities and happenings over the past few days, which have been very eventful from what I'm hearing. So we'll go ahead, begin with a word of prayer. We'll ask Brother David Hicks, if he can, lead us in that prayer. Amen. Okay, if you want to open your Bibles to Psalm 90, is going to be the text which we're going to examine this morning. For the next 13 weeks, we're going to be finishing out a study we did about 26 weeks ago, where we did the first part of the Psalms. Now, we only hit a couple of them, seeing for 13 weeks. But there's a lot of really good lessons and a lot of really good challenges for God's people. Especially what the Psalms do is that they give us an insight to the heart of God's servants in times of old. In fact, it challenges us not just in respect to how we worship God, but also how we think of God on a daily basis. One of the most interesting things, at least about the text that we're going to be examining, I want you to look at verse number 17 of Psalm 90. Verse number 17 of Psalm 90. We don't use this word that often. In fact, we sing a song where this deals with Jesus, but we don't normally use this particular word to describe God. It would say, "Let the beauty of the Lord our God be upon us." Now, when you think of God, is beautiful a word you would use to describe God? It seems like a good word to describe God. Most people would call Him almighty. They would call Him gracious. They would call Him merciful. Really, when you think about one of the most attractive traits that people try to use to describe something that they really like or it's really appealing to them, they use the word beautiful. Now, in the Hebrew, the word beautiful here actually is emphasizing the kindness of God. What makes God beautiful? It's how He responds in His kindness. And if you look at verse 7 and onward, the psalmist is going to say, "But your anger has been turned to us." If you think about when someone does you wrong or does you dirty, is it possible for you to respond to them in kindness, or do you attack them with your words and your emotions take advantage of you and you just let them have it because you're just sick and tired of this? But the kindness of God, the beauty of God, what makes God beautiful is despite all the flaws that you and I have and have done in our life and all of our shortcomings and failures, God still offers His mercy, forgiveness, and love to us today. And that's what we're going to read from Psalm 90 today. How can I see the beauty of God in my life, not just for me, but there's going to be some challenges that are presented from this text that we've really got to take seriously. This past week, there were a couple of things that were said between both the school and just different things in passing in conversations with people that just made me think, are we actually focused on wanting to go to heaven? Now, I know the answer to that is yes, but sometimes there's side excursions. If you have a vacation plan to go to, we'll say Dollywood. There's better places than Dollywood. But if you have a vacation plan going to Dollywood, what are you eventually going to stop at on the way? They stop at food places. They get hungry. Where else do they stop? Buc-ee's. Yes, okay. That is applicable today. 5 years ago, that would not exist. What is Buc-ee's? Besides a food place. A gas station. People got to stop for gas or you can't make it all the way. Side excursions is what I'm thinking of. When we take a long journey, there's normally stops that we kind of intend happening. It's not necessarily that we have to stop there. Now, gas stations, that's a little bit different. If you don't stop there when you need gas, it's going to be a long time before you get your destination. But we anticipate that. What about in our journey to heaven? Are there possible side stops that we make where we say it's necessary for us to step off from the road to heaven, take a side excursion in the world, and then come back on the pathway to heaven? Well, it happens to everyone. Jesus is the only one who actually stayed on that pathway. So as we're looking through the challenges of Psalm 90 today, really take seriously into consideration, am I truly admiring the beauty of God in my life? The way the book breaks this down, we'll kind of look at these headings and we'll describe this here in a moment. The way that the book breaks this chapter down, verses 1 through 6, talking about the magnificence of God, or really in light of what makes God mighty. And we'll look at his character here in a moment. I think it extends across the first 6 verses. But then it also talks about verse 7 down to about verse 12, the similarities of man. Man struggles with the same problem, being sin. We've talked about this frequently. But because we all struggle with the same thing, how are we approaching this problem of our sin problem? And then in the end, how do we gain the reward, or at least how long, O Lord, is, I believe, the heading of it. Return, O Lord, making a plea back to God to come back to the individual who's pleading toward him. Now, I don't necessarily want to take that kind of route as we go through this psalm. There's many ways to make it to the same place. Not in the sense of leaving sound doctrine out, but if we're looking at a text, there's going to be certain things that will pop out to you that maybe doesn't pop out to me. But I want to look at this psalm as a whole. So let's read the psalm, and then we're going to begin to build some puzzle pieces, brick by brick, so that we can truly, when we get to the rooftop, see the beauty of the Lord. Beginning in verse 1, Psalm 90, the psalmist would write, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You turn man to destruction and say, Return, O children of men, for 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it is past, and like a watch in the night. You carry them away like a flood, and they are like asleep. In the morning they are like grass which grows up. In the morning it flourishes and grows up. In the evening it is cut down and withers. For we have been consumed by your anger, and by your wrath we are terrified. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your countenance. For all our days have passed away in your wrath. We finish our years like a sigh. The days of our lives are 70 years, and if by reason of strength, they are 80 years. Yet their boast is only labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off, and we fly away. And who knows the power of your anger? For as the fear of you, so is your wrath. So teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Return, O Lord, how long? And have compassion on your servants. O satisfy us early with your mercy, that we may rejoice and be glad all of our days. Make us glad according to the days in which you have afflicted us, the years in which we have seen evil. Let your work appear to your servants, and your glory to their children. And let the beauty of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. Now, it's really easy to identify when you're reading through this all the negative things, and that's kind of the takeaway here. Lord, how long will your anger be upon us? In fact, notice how the psalmist brings out in verse 7, 8, 9, we've been consumed by your anger. By your wrath we are terrified. And you have set our iniquities before you and our secret sins in the light of your countenance. Now, the idea of secret sins is not like what we read in Leviticus 6 and 7, where you read about if a king had acted unknowingly, he violated the law, or if an individual unknowingly violated the law. Kurt, we're in Psalm 90, sorry. There was a sacrifice for that. In fact, not just for the king, but for the priest and for the people themselves. That's not what this is saying. The word for secret there in the Hebrew are sins that I try to conceal. So think about the child who did it, and mom and dad are asking, did you do this? And they're saying, no, and the parents can tell he's lying or she's lying. It's not going to bode well for that child in that aftermath. But there are times where we try to hide things from God, and that's not good. How much does God see and know? Everything. He sees all things. So how hard is it to hide things from God? It's impossible to hide anything from God. Now, there's also another type of, this is more of a second layer to this. Is it possible to be doing something and you've done it so long that you don't even recognize or identify that it is wrong, and then you're standing before God and you're saying, but God, I thought, and then you're trying to give reasons to justify what you're doing? How do we keep from callousing our mind or searing our mind, the way that Paul would tell Timothy? How do we keep ourselves from searing our mind from the seriousness of sin? Do we got to have brain surgery? Probably not that. So what tools does God give us to keep us soft-hearted, so to speak? Huh? The Bible. What does the Bible do? What does it speak to? Speaks to sinners. What part of sinners? So this is true. So I guess what I'm asking is what part of the person called a sinner does the Word of God appeal to? Because if it speaks to my elbow or my kneecap or even this hard noggin that I got right here, it doesn't necessarily stick with me. The heart. Yes, the inner part of the heart. And when we're talking about heart, at least in light of Old Testament, New Testament, we're talking about the soul or the mind of an individual. My very being. If I take the words of the Creator and I say these aren't applicable to me, but they apply to everybody else, so we could take like a Matthew 7 idea. I'm building that long plank to jump off whatever ship I'm trying to build. I'm building the long plank trying to build excuses to God, and I refuse to acknowledge the Creator's correction on how I can be more like Him. Then there's going to be terrible consequences. Now, this whole psalm begins with, notice back in verse number 1, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. The introduction to this chapter that we're looking at, it talks about a little bit of the background of this particular psalm. This is the only psalm that is attributed to Moses, but we do need to be careful when we read the top part of the Psalms in our Bibles. If you notice above each of the Psalms in your Bible, there's probably like a little statement that says a prayer of, or a song of, or a something of, and it gives a person's name. Well, those things were added in the 2nd and 3rd century A.D. Some would even indicate that it was in the Septuagint the LXX, some of the Psalms had headings up above, but those headings were created by a particular Jewish rabbi based off of oral tradition that he had heard over time. And what I'm not saying is that they're incorrect. Some of them might be. It's just according to oral tradition in some cases. But there is a possibility that this could be the case. If we're talking about an individual who's longing for God to see them again, longing for God to forgive them again, longing for God to give them a place of rest again because of their disobedience, and if we're going to say this particular psalm is attributed to Moses, what time period do you think is under consideration as we read this psalm? Which part of the Mosaic? That's a long time. Well, Brenda's right. So the Mosaic time period, so from the time of Sinai all the way to Acts chapter 2. Now, if Moses wrote this, we have to immediately limit it to the days of Moses. Which part of Moses' life do you think Psalm 90 is about? His time in Egypt, his time in the wilderness as a shepherd, or his time in the wilderness with Israel? It's going to be a long Sunday. Okay, there was one time only, when God had promised quite literally what could have taken about 2.5 years, according to Numbers 13, what could have taken 2.5 years between Egypt to the Promised Land, ended up being extended 20 times over, close to 20 times over, and became a 40-year wilderness wandering. Why? Didn't obey. Disobedience. In fact, what's interesting is there were all kinds of disobedience. It wasn't just necessarily the spies that went in and 10 of them came back with bad reports and 2 of them had good reports. But what's even more interesting is that there were people so sold just on the idea that God said He was going to deliver them into a promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey, figure of speech, for everything good and prosperous. There were some people so enthralled with the poetic license of that idea that after God had said, you're going to wander in the wilderness and you're going to die in the wilderness because of your disobedience, there were people who were enchanted by an old statement of God, refusing to acknowledge what God said, you're not going to enter in. They still tried to enter into the promised land and they died. Didn't even enter in. Do you think it's possible we become so enthralled over the idea, I am God's child, that maybe we forget, there's repercussions if we fail to listen? And that's what this whole psalm is dealing with. God, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. The psalm begins with probably the hardest challenge for any servant of God. I want you to think of your family. And I want you to read that first line of Psalm 90, verse 1. Is it the case that the Lord has been the dwelling place for your entire family in all generations? This causes a plethora of responses. There is, from we'll say the absolute ideal situation. Oh yes, I have been a faithful child of God. My family has been faithful children of God, generation upon generation. My father married my mother. Well, not in that order. They weren't my father and mother before they got married. But, they married each other. They became my father and mother. Their parents were faithful members of the Lord's body, and there's just faithfulness all around. In fact, their children, you'll hear in some stories, all 3 of their boys, 2 of them became preachers. One of them is an elder in the Lord's church. They've been faithful. They have generation upon generation of faithful children of God. That is ideal. Realistically, here's what that looks like. You will have separated families where either the husband or the wife is a child of God and the other one is not. Or you may have the mother and father of children of God. You have a child who is old enough to understand, and they refuse to acknowledge following God's ways. Or it could be the case that mom and dad could care less about following God, and then the children are faithful to God. Here's the point. Faithfulness is found very differently from generation to generation. The rules have not changed. Now, if we're talking about the patriarchal law and the law of Moses and the law of Jesus, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about faithfulness to God has always been this. If God commands this, you keep this, God promises and gives. It's always been that way, from the garden all the way to the end of time. Just some of the particulars have changed. So does that mean the families who have a generational history of struggling to have complete faithfulness in their family, they're any less important than people who seem to have the success stories? No. They're equally important. In fact, my heart goes out harder toward those. God's heart goes out harder towards those who have to struggle with that every day. And if your family is not entirely faithful and you don't find yourself struggling with that, you've got a heart problem. If it does not tear you to pieces every day, then how can you read this first verse and say, the Lord has been our dwelling place in all generations? How can it be said that the beauty of the Lord is truly shining in its brightest to you and your loved ones? Now, God's mercy is extended to all of your family, and we need to acknowledge that. But the psalmist is not initially saying, oh, we need to consider every aspect of our well-being in this. He does, to an extent. But there's different ways people are going to read this. And the hardest challenge is verse 1. What about my loved ones? Well, let's continue in the text and see what it tells us more about God. As I begin reading through this, if God is my dwelling place, and quite literally it's the idea, Lord, you have been our dwelling place for all generations. We're going to see in the lesson later on this morning from Isaiah 66, where is my dwelling place, God would say. Where is my home? And verse 2 would say, my home is with those who are brokenhearted and of a contrite spirit. If you're broken and you're trying to do the best you can in life with what little that you have, and you're trying to make diamonds out of what seems like coal every day, God loves those kind of people, because those are the people willing to get their hands dirty so that they can glorify Him. Oh, and God polishes them up along the way. That's the beautiful aspect. If God is not your dwelling place, we've got a heart problem. But if He is, notice it continues in verse number 1, how it describes God. Verse number 2, it would say, before the mountains were brought forth, or you ever had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Before I called you home, before I called you mine, before you called me yours, and even after my departure from this place, Lord, you always have been. How comforting is that to know that there will be a time you will not be able to protect or do anything for your children or your loved ones, but God can. That's an assurance policy, not insurance. Insurance supposes the idea possibility. Assurance imposes the idea it will. Blessed assurance. God will protect those beyond my lifetime. He's protected those before my lifetime. And notice how He's worked with these individuals. Verse number 3, you turn man to destruction. Another translation would say, you allow man to go his own way. Yet you say to them, return, O children of men, for 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it's past, and like a watch in the night. In other words, even though you allow men to do whatever they want to, everybody has always chosen what, according to the psalmist? Sin. Sin. That thing you said, oh, I'm going to enjoy this, God didn't. And now that you're in that place, oh, I'm going to enjoy this, God still says, come home. Come back. Let me help you. Now, if you've ever tried to get in old Sparky or old Fluffy who ran outside and they're not supposed to be outside, there are two possible responses from your pet. Let's think of the greater outcome. You call your pet and they come right to you. That's ideal. But then your pet's being obnoxious and rebellious that day, and you call them to come to you. What do they normally do? They run away. Oh, game, hide and seek. Oh. You think sometimes we play games with God and we don't realize it? Ooh. God allows you to make choices, but then when you fail in your choices and you make bad decisions, God calls you back. Do you act nothing more than an animal playing a game? See, this is the beauty of God. In that God, though He lives forever, you're probably not the first case in some of the things that you've done. In fact, by this point in human history, I'm pretty sure every possible sin that could ever be committed was committed way back when. That's why we have those huge lists in Deuteronomy and Exodus and even Galatians chapter 5 and other places as well. It's already been done. It's already been done. So whatever you've done, it's nothing new to God. God already knew this. In fact, before everything, God already knew all the possibilities. So what am I supposed to take from this? We'll talk about that here in a second. So when I look at the options that God gives me, He calls me back. But then in verse 4, time is like nothing to Him. But there's a problem. Though time is nothing to God, what about you and I? This is verse 10 through 12. Notice how the psalmist begins to say, God, you allow us to go our own ways, and we become the rebellious animal, and we turn away from you, and we don't come back. But God, even though you're eternal, and you've existed before I have, and you will far long exist even after I'm done here on earth, I don't. My time is limited. Notice he would say in verse number 10, the days of our lives are 70 years, and if by reason of strength they are 80 years, yet their boast is only labor and sorrow. In other words, look at what I've done. The next question is, at what cost? Normally, if you build up something really great, there's a lot of investment, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that went into that. Building relationships, same thing. Think of all the things that people labor for under the sun today. What do you have to show for it? Maybe there's some positive things. Maybe you have nothing to show for it. It just depends. It varies. But teach us to number our days. Help us to remember no matter how long we live. The only thing really we get out of this life, if that's all we're dependent on, we get to boast about, look at how much I've worked. And by the time you finally get to enjoy it, you're too old to get to enjoy it because now your bones are aching, your mind is cranky, and you need coffee and you can't find coffee, or maybe you throw the coffee out the window and then you say, why did I do that? You can't really enjoy it the way you want to. And that's what the psalmist is saying. Notice he would say, our life is soon cut off and we fly away. Verse number 12, so teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. This goes to the question, when's the best time to do what verse number 11 says? As the fear of God is, so is the wrath of God. There are two conditions you can be in with God. Number one, you're either pleasing to Him, or number two, He's not pleased with you at all. But if I look at the absoluteness, if I follow God and keep His commandments, and I faithfully follow Him all the days of my life, what does He promise? Eternal life. If I take the flip side of that, everything opposite to what I just said, what does God promise? Eternal condemnation, eternal punishment. Just as the condemnation of God is absolute, the commendation or the promises of God are absolute as well. And it's not because God has made the promise. He's going to carry it out regardless of what I do. I know He's going to carry out His promises regardless of what I do, but I may take myself away from the category of the promised for good to the promise for evil. And I've got to be mindful of that, no matter how many days I live. Now, some people take verse number 10 and they say, see, God guarantees me 70 years. That's garbage. Think of all the little girls whose lives were lost in the past couple of days. Some of them didn't even hit 10, not even a decade. Think of some of the people who were in their 50s, 40s, swept away in the floods. 10 months ago, we faced somewhat of a similar crisis in this region. And how many of those people were younger than 70? What about 80? Does it guarantee I'm going to make it to 80? No. The ideal time, if maybe by reason of strength, we live beyond 70, maybe 80. But don't aim for that. Do not aim for, I'm going to live this long and this is what I'm going to do. What God aims us to aim for, verse number 12, number our days. I don't know how long I have, but I know what I can do about today. And that's what he says. Teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. I'm not going to live forever. That's the principle. I'm not going to be here forever. But go back to verse 1 and verse 2. If God is a dwelling place in all generations, that extends to the generations I will not be a part of because he's everlasting. If I carefully treat my steps with wisdom, with cautiousness, not overly cautious, but cautious to the degree I'm putting up barriers where God asked me to put up barriers in my life so that I'm on the straight and narrow way. If I follow that, according to the psalmist, is wisdom. David, you had a comment? So how much more strength to make it from 80 to 90, and then 90 to 100, and then 100 to 110? And I think the Bible sometimes is flaunting at times. He was 120, and his eyes were not dim, and he could see just fine. I was like, be quiet. I don't want to hear this. Yes. Now you couple that with what he would say in James 1, I think it's like verse 6 to verse 11, and it talks about let the brother of low degree exalt or rejoice in that he is exalted, but the one who is prideful, let him be humble, for no sooner as the sun sooner riseth or risen, as the King James would say, it's cut off. Life is like grass, and we're in mowing season right now. How frequently do people have to mow? Some people do it weekly, and I don't understand those people. I just don't. I like every other week. Now, the first couple of mows that you do, it's like you mow it and the next day, did I even mow? And that happens, and then it slows down after a while. Oh, that's true too. Okay, so are you a Bermuda blade or a monkey blade or? Oh. But that's the principle there. If grass doesn't have a long lifespan, yet we see it all the time, but then we're frequently cutting it. Every time you see someone mowing, just think, that's the end of my life. That's the end of my life. And it's keeping death in perspective. And it's not necessarily death. Death is an uncomfortable process from what I hear and what I've read. What makes it even more just weird is you don't know when. You know it will, but you don't know when. And if you love surprises or hate surprises, that's the right phrase. If you hate surprises, you're going to hate death. But that's the point. Be ready. When it happens, according to the psalmist, no man can contain the soul in the day of death. When it is gone, it is gone. Now, what about if they bring your soul back and they resuscitate? I don't know how that works. I don't know how it works. I just know that the Bible would say that when you're dead, you're dead. That is it. There's no coming back till the resurrection. And that's John 11. Yes, and that's the point. Always be ready. Always be ready. And God takes that into consideration, not so much to say, well, if God knows it'll take people longer than certain people, how does He work that? I don't know. That starts getting in the providence of God. He knows things we don't. But that doesn't mean that we can't prepare ourselves now. I can have that assurance now. And that's what Moses is trying to get at. When I look at the qualities of God, He is eternal. He is a dwelling place. I want you to notice in verse number 7 through 9, and then I want us to look at verse 13 to get the ending idea of this. We have been consumed by your anger. Now, the anger that he's referencing, again, because we're talking about the children of Israel in the wilderness, we have brought you or provoked you to wrath because of our dealings. Did God put a hedge or a wall around Caleb, Joshua, Moses? Yeah, we'll just keep it at that. Did He put a hedge around them while they were in the wilderness wanderings? Or did they have to suffer just like the rest of the children of Israel? They had to suffer just as much. In fact, what's interesting, if you read the book of Habakkuk, only 3 chapters, when you read that book, it deals with that question. God, why do the righteous suffer when it should be the wicked who suffer? Well, as a nation, there's going to be some things you're just going to have to go through. But if you look at Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4, a key verse that appears back in the book of Romans, the just shall live by faith. If God says you will prevail, now the ending's going to be a wee bit rough in your life, but if you're faithful to me through the good times and faithful to me through the rough times, I've got you even beyond this persecution. In fact, think of, at times, it could be said, think of the persecution as the final push before you make it into eternity, as God would tell Habakkuk. Yes? Ooh, that's a really good question. I tend to think, so 4 or 5 generations ago, I consider all the men in here to be like men. But, there was a time and place where even a young boy, in his 13s, who could, kill a bear and a lion, and he's being called off to war just a couple years later, and just the thing those guys who went through World War I and World War II, dude, those were men, capital bold letters. Way back in the day, when you've got men who are trekking miles in their 80s and 90s and 100s, and however in the world Genesis 5 worked out, where people lived to be 600, 700, 800, I don't know if the aging or the physique change was much different than what it was now. That's kind of a lesson that I'm trying to work on. I think that was a question you had asked a few weeks ago, Marilyn. I want to look and see how the idea of aging has somewhat changed, and maybe consider what some of those changing agents might be, if it was the air or it was the food or the dirt, or maybe God just made it where they didn't age as fast. I don't know. If He can create a full-grown man and woman on day one, then I'm sure He can arrest the aging process if He wanted to. But how that looked like, I don't know. But that's a really good question. I think He was strong because He built His own house when He entered the Promised Land. No. There are things in McDonald's food that will keep you from aging if you see how it doesn't age after thousands of years. Oh, genetics. Good enough. Those are called MIC genetics. That's true. We'll do a lesson on that. Possibly when we do a series on interesting questions from the Bible. That's one of the obscure ones. So that's a good question. Keep it in mind. But that's going to drive me down a rabbit hole. So when I look at what God is asking, consider Him before it's too late. Now, if you look at verse 13 and following, I want you to notice these beautiful traits about God. Now, teach us to number our days, verse 12, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. But notice what the psalmist is saying. This is what we're missing when we're in a relationship away from you. Return, O Lord. How long? Trait number 1, have compassion on your servants. Oh, satisfy us, I find this interesting, early with your mercy. When's the best time of day to do the hard work? Early in the morning, because you're normally too tired at the end of the day, or maybe you woke up just way too tired. But normally by the time you start it way later in the day, you've got less strength and energy, and it's just harder to do. Satisfy us early. I can't wait. Which may imply as well there has been this seemingly endless night where God's wrath has been turned upon us. But God, at the first chance, give us your mercy early. Think of Lamentations 3. When the sun rises, it is because of the Lord's mercies we are consumed not, because they are new every morning. Begin in verse 19 of Lamentations 3 and read to the end of the chapter, and that picture just makes it seem like there's a young man who's sitting on a hill. He's watching the sunrise from darkness going into light, and it's just a heart full of appreciation. But if you look in the latter part of chapter 3, the young man is still sorrowing from something he is having to endure at that time. I find it a very encouraging verse. But Moses says, satisfy us early with your mercy. This is before Lamentations 3, probably about 700, 800 years before the writing of Lamentation. So satisfy us early with your mercy, that we may rejoice and be glad all of our days. Make us glad according to the days in which you have afflicted us. This is where I was. I was lost, but now I have a relationship with you again. Lord, let those days be so pleasant, I forget about the bad days. And there's coming a day like that, is there not, where there will be no more sorrow, no more pain, no more tears. And that is the day where we are with God. But that's not the end of his descriptive terms. Notice in verse number 16, let your work appear to your servants and your glory to their children. So let the beauty of the Lord our God be upon us. Compassion, mercy, his work. Now, this is more than just creation. This could be the providence of God working in your life. It could be the work of God through the Word. And you look at the blessings that God has given his servants over time, and you look around the world today, and you consider the many blessings that God has given to people around you. And this is probably a second most challenge to the challenge of Psalm 90, verse 1. Can you look at other people's blessings and thank God that he gave them to them? Not you, to them. That's hard. And it requires one to be selfless. But your works, why do I need to be mindful of God's works? Well, notice where these works connect with your servants, but then even beyond the servants, your glory to their children. There's an interesting text in Ecclesiastes 9, verse 1, where it talks about a wise man is one who will commit their works unto God. Why would it be wise for the things you do in life? Why would it be wise to leave those in the hands of God even after you are gone? How long does God live compared to you and I? Ooh, forever. Think about the works you and I can do that can last beyond this lifetime, far into eternity. Those are the kind of works Moses is emphasizing. If I consider God's works, because I'm his servant, and I consider his glory that is shown to my children or to your children and even beyond, then it can be said that our work will be established, verse 17. Yes, second time said, establish the work of our hands. We desire to work toward finding God's compassion, finding God's mercy, but also we desire to share those same traits of God And when those whom we love, who are under us and generations under us, when they come about, they don't have to go through those same problems we did, because we've worked that out. And if you think in the Bible, especially the Old Testament with the building of the temple, David had good intentions. He wanted to build, but God said, no, your son's going to do it. But that didn't stop David from preparing everything Solomon needed for it. So what are you preparing so that the generation under you will have a different type of work, but it's because you've already done the foundation. Now they get to build up the rest of the temple. It requires foresight, it requires patience, but also it requires us to be thankful for God. Praise be to God that, verse 1, if He's the dwelling place of our life, He can also be the dwelling place of lives far beyond our own. And maybe one day in heaven, we'll get to see them too. So thank you for your time and attention. Lord willing, next week we're only going one psalm over. We're going to Psalm 91. Go ahead, read that psalm, make some thoughts, and we'll have some discussion on that, Lord willing, next week. Thank you for the comments and really good studies. So we'll be back in about 15-ish minutes.